On December the 29th, 2001, just 2 nights before the new year, families filled the narrow streets of Mesa Redonda in the heart of Lima. They moved shoulder to shoulder through the crowded corridors, searching for fireworks and toys, for the small things they could afford to mark the turning of the year. Vendors called out above the noise as children clutched handfuls of coins and carried plastic bags nearly as big as themselves. The air held that familiar holiday warmth. Noise, colour, expectation, the sense that midnight would bring something better. No one imagined they were living their last ordinary moments. Within minutes, explosions ripped through the marketplace, at first indistinguishable from the sounds of celebration, and then unmistakably wrong. Fire leapt from stall to stall, racing along streets stacked high with pyrotechnics. Laughter fractured into panic. Parents shouted names into the dark, straining to hear an answer that never came. By the end of the night, hundreds were gone. This is the story of the Mesa Redonda fire. To understand how that night unfolded, you have to understand the place itself. In the heart of Peru's capital lies Mesa Redonda, situated within the Cercado de Lima, the city's historic downtown. For decades, it has been one of the city's most intense commercial districts, a tightly woven maze of narrow streets, stacked galleries and improvised stalls where low-cost goods change hands in enormous volume. It grew not from blueprints, but from people trying to survive. It began as a modest cluster of street vendors and food stalls, and gradually transformed as waves of rural migrants arrived in the capital during the economic crises of the 1980s and 1990s. Formal jobs were scarce, inflation was crushing, and the city offered few guarantees, so they built their own opportunities. Sidewalk by sidewalk, stall by stall, Mesa Redonda rose through quiet persistence. Parents selling toys to cover school fees, migrants unloading boxes before dawn, and couples working shoulder to shoulder in shops no larger than a bedroom. Each small counter was more than a business. It was a family's lifeline. When authorities later reorganized vendors into compact, multi-story galleries, the physical landscape changed, but the spirit did not. Behind each metal shutter was a family business, often run by generations working side by side in narrow corridors humming with customers. The district grew block by block, covering tens of thousands of square meters and drawing in people from across the city. Yet at its core, it remained personal, a place where livelihoods depended on daily sales, where neighbours knew one another by name, and where the rhythm of commerce was inseparable from the lives it supported. Mesa Redonda was more than just a market. It was a community built under pressure, shaped by resilience and sustained by people who had few other options but to make it work. Only a few blocks from Peru's Congress and the colonial heart of Lima, a UNESCO World Heritage Zone, Mesa Redonda operated at full intensity, a dense marketplace woven tightly into one of the most historically significant corners of the city. Each December, Mesa Redonda became the city's unofficial supply centre for fireworks. As Christmas gave way to New Year's Eve, boxes of pyrotechnics were stacked beside toys and decorations, and the narrow district swelled with shoppers determined not to miss out. On the evening of December 29, 2001, Mesa Redonda felt less like a marketplace and more like a tide of humanity pressing through stone corridors never meant to hold so many people. Entire families had come out together, determined to secure fireworks before supplies ran out. Fathers negotiated prices while mothers kept children close at hand. Teenagers darted between stalls comparing brands and sizes. The crowd moved in waves, pausing, compressing, inching forward again. Merchants had expanded beyond their shop fronts, building temporary displays that spilled into the streets. Boxes of fireworks were stacked chest high against walls, wedged beneath tables and balanced on makeshift wooden platforms. Delivery vans stood with their rear doors open, inventory exposed for quick sales. In some cases, excess stock had been carried upwards and stored on flat rooftops, the cardboard cartons resting beneath the open sky just a few metres above the crush of shoppers below. The air pulsed with sales pitches and the sharp crack of test fireworks ignited to prove their quality. Sparks drew cheers, Few noticed the frayed cables overhead or how vehicles narrowed already tight exits. By later estimates, hundreds of tons of fireworks were concentrated within those few city blocks, an extraordinary amount of explosive material gathered in one of the most congested corners of Lima. At around 7 p.m. that night, the sound of the night market changed. What began as a routine burst of fireworks, a sound no one in Mesa Redonda would have found unusual, became the spark that unravelled everything. An explosion ignited nearby stockpiles of pyrotechnics, and within seconds the reaction spread, with fire tearing through the market in waves as it raced across 4 tightly packed city blocks and engulfed the same narrow streets that moments earlier had been filled with families preparing to celebrate. Fed by thousands of fireworks detonating one after another, the flames moved with terrifying speed. Temperatures surged beyond 1,100 degrees Celsius, creating a level of heat few inside could possibly survive. Alleyways were turned into furnaces and stairwells into traps. Buildings that had stood for decades were consumed within minutes. Witnesses described the panic as sudden and disorienting. Smoke thickened within moments, turning familiar corridors into blind passageways. People began pushing towards exits that were already narrow and partially blocked by stalls and parked vehicles. Parents lifted children above their shoulders so they could breathe. Others tried to force metal security doors open as heat warped the frames. The soundscape changed from bargaining and laughter to screaming, shouting, and the percussive blast of fireworks exploding at ground level. Some froze, some ran. Some tried to save merchandise before the scale of the danger became clear. Survivors later spoke of being separated from relatives in seconds, a hand slipping away in the crush of bodies, a voice lost in the smoke. In the streets, vehicles trapped in gridlock became obstacles and in some cases, death traps. Inside multi-storey galleries, stairwells filled with heat and black smoke, forcing people to make impossible choices. Go up, go down, or stay where they were. Panic in that environment was not just fear but disorientation, as visibility dropped and the air burned in the lungs. Explosions were coming from every direction as rockets shot horizontally into crowds and storefronts. People could not always tell where the fire was moving next. The very sound that had signalled celebration minutes earlier now meant danger, but by the time that understanding took hold, escape routes were already narrowing. Many survivors vividly remembered the noise, the relentless detonations mixed with screams and the crackling roar of fire, and the overwhelming heat. In that moment, Mesa Redonda ceased to be a marketplace. It became a maze filled with smoke, flame, and thousands of terrified people trying to find a way out. Others struggled to describe what they had witnessed. Augusto Vega, watching from the window of his apartment, saw a firecracker set off in the street below. At first it seemed harmless, part of the holiday noise, and then it struck nearby boxes of fireworks and the chain reaction began. Vega scrambled across adjoining rooftops, hauling a broken ladder behind him in an effort to reach people stranded above the flames. He managed to help a child to safety and tried desperately to rescue a disabled man, but the heat and smoke closed in too quickly. Others, he said, stayed behind to protect their merchandise and never made it out. Below, 31-year-old Jose Fernandez Vega found himself trapped in streets choked with smoke as taxis and delivery vans ignited around him. From his hospital bed, his arms and face burned, he recalled the panic, people screaming inside cars and shopping galleries, elderly shoppers unable to move fast enough, parents searching for children in air that could scarcely be breathed. Convinced he was about to die, he climbed over the tops of burning vehicles, following the brief flash of a rocket through the darkness, because it was the only light he could see. More than 400 firefighters were called in from across Lima, converging on Mesa Redonda as the sky above the historic centre glowed orange. What they found was not a single structure fire, but an entire district burning at once. Streets were littered with stalled cars and delivery vans, their doors flung open, many already ablaze. Crowds of relatives and onlookers pressed towards the cordons, desperate for news, while low water pressure hampered early efforts to bring the flames under control. Fire engines struggled to manoeuvre through lanes never designed for emergency access, and hoses had to be dragged by hand into corridors thick with smoke. Inside the galleries, conditions were catastrophic. Security shutters that shopkeepers had pulled down to protect their goods from looters had warped in the heat, sealing exits and trapping those inside. Stairwells acted like chimneys, funneling flames upwards. Firefighters later described heat so intense it forced them back repeatedly, even in full protective gear. Lima's fire chief at the time, Tullio Nicolini, called it one of the most difficult fires we have ever faced, noting that crews were battling not only flames, but constant explosions as fireworks continued to detonate around them. The scenes they encountered were harrowing. Bodies were discovered in the streets, in burned-out vehicles, and inside the gutted galleries of small shops that had offered no refuge from the heat. One firefighter emerged from the smoke carrying a baby in his arms as colleagues cleared a path through the crowd. Others fashioned makeshift stretchers from plastic sheeting to carry the burned and dying towards waiting ambulances. Rescue teams worked methodically, moving from building to building, unsure whether they would find survivors or more victims. By evening, more than 250 bodies had been recovered, and the search was far from over. Many were found where the fire had overtaken them in the open street. Others were discovered beneath collapsed roofs and twisted metal, in shops where they had tried to shelter, or behind metal doors that had become fatal barriers. The work continued through the night, illuminated by portable floodlights, as firefighters dug through the ruins of a marketplace that only hours earlier had been alive with celebration. As dawn broke over Lima, the smoke hung low above the historic centre, and the full weight of what had happened began to settle in. The official death toll would stand at 291 people, with more than 180 reported missing in the immediate aftermath, and nearly 200 injured, many suffering severe burns. In the days that followed, some of the missing were identified among the dead, but families waited in agonizing uncertainty as authorities worked to account for those who had vanished in the inferno. Unofficial estimates would later suggest the true number of victims may have approached 400 or more, as the extreme heat made precise identification painfully difficult. Hospitals across the capital filled quickly. Corridors were lined with relatives clutching photographs, repeating names, and moving from ward to ward in search of answers. Doctors and nurses worked without pause. Burn units were overwhelmed, and survivors spoke in fragments, of smoke so thick it felt solid, of hands lost in the crush of bodies, of heat that seemed to strip the air itself away. In the ruins of Mesa Redonda, recovery teams continued their grim task. Many bodies were so badly burned that identification was impossible without forensic testing. Some were never conclusively identified at all. Dozens were buried in Lima's El Angel cemetery in graves marked only with numbers, a stark reminder of how many families were left without certainty. For parents and spouses, the absence of a name on a headstone became another quiet wound. President Alejandro Toledo returned to the capital and declared national days of mourning. Standing before reporters, he described the fire as one of the most tragic moments I've had to live through as a person and as president. Lima's fire chief, Tullio Nicolini, called it one of the most difficult blazes crews had ever confronted, pointing not only to the flames, but to the density of people and fireworks packed into streets never meant to hold either. The human cost was immeasurable. Nearly 300 lives were lost and hundreds of families were altered forever. Children left without parents, and businesses built over decades reduced to ash in minutes. The financial cost was also staggering. Entire commercial galleries were destroyed. Estimates at the time placed property and commercial losses in the tens of millions of US dollars, devastating for small merchants whose entire livelihoods had been concentrated in a single stall or shop. For many, there was no insurance to soften the blow. In response, authorities announced sweeping measures. The production, importation and sale of fireworks without proper authorization were banned in central Lima. Police raids intensified in the months that followed. Vendors were relocated to designated areas with stricter controls and regulations governing storage limits. Electrical systems and emergency access were tightened also. Enforcement became more visible, especially in December when inspections and confiscations increased dramatically. And yet, even as reforms were introduced, the deeper challenges remained. Poverty, informal commerce, and the cultural pull of fireworks during the holiday season. Within days of the disaster, vendors were again visible in outlying neighbourhoods, a sign of how intertwined tradition and economic necessity had become. What endured beyond the legislation were the human stories. Neighbours who ran back into smoke-filled corridors to search for strangers. Firefighters who carried children from collapsing buildings, families who spent the new year not beneath fireworks but in hospital waiting rooms or cemetery grounds. Mesa Redonda would rebuild, stalls would reopen, and commerce would return. But the memory of that night, of laughter turning to screams, of corridors turning to furnaces, would remain etched into the city's consciousness. For Lima, December 29, 2001 was not just a fire. It was the night hundreds walked into Mesa Redonda expecting to celebrate the new year and never walked out. Now, this was a terrible tragedy with huge loss of life, and our condolences go out to the families who lost loved ones. But I hope you like the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll say goodbye for now.